IIS Part 1. In this nugget, we discuss Internet Information Server Part 1. IIS is really easy to install. The only thing to really note is that it's not installed in previous versions of Windows, so if you expect to see it, you'll have to go to Add Remove Programs and manually install it yourself. Also, server configuration has a few key options that you'll need to be aware of, and we'll take a look at that. Then we'll look at the properties of both your web server as well as all of the individual websites that you can look at as well. And the key thing there is that the properties are really probably 90% of the administration of IIS. That's where you do most of your work. So we'll be taking a look at those in this part of the nugget, and then we'll continue the properties sheets within the IIS Part 2 in our next nugget. Then we'll take a look at how to create the website of your own, and then we'll take a look at how to view the website as well. There are a number of different ways of doing that, and a key part of that is making sure that DNS is configured properly. In the past, you haven't had to install IIS in previous versions of Windows, such as NT4 and Windows Server 2 and Windows 2000. And the reason for that is because it was already installed for you by default, but that caused a lot of problems because just a server running IIS and its accompanying service became susceptible to various exploits out there on the internet that would be able to attack a computer and ultimately, in some cases, take all or nearly complete control of that machine. So Microsoft has decided now we don't want to accidentally create zombies out there just waiting to be taken over. So instead what they've done is they said, hey, if you want IIS, you're going to have to install it yourself, and you can do it pretty much any one of 2 or 3 different ways. You can go to Control Panel and then Add Remove Programs, and then you'll see in the Add Remove Windows Components item here that you can choose to install IIS. And this would be installed through the Application Server option here, so you could double-click that or that and click Details, either one, and then select IIS here. Now notice that it gives us kind of a grayed out checkbox. This means that it doesn't select every item available with IIS, such as an FTP server, that's not included. But it also enables Network Complex Access, which allows us to use distributed applications so that many applications can use common components. But if I double click on IIS here, you see that there are several other things that I could also choose. What we get here is just the basics. We want the World Wide Web Service and the IIS Services Manager, which is an MMC console. And there are other things that we could get as well. There are also common files that are necessary to install IIS. In the World Wide Web Service, you can double-click there, and you see that there are several additional things we could choose. We won't exhaust all these because we're just going to get the basics of what we need. However, on this page, there are a couple things that might be noteworthy. One of those is Active Server Pages. By default, that's not installed. However, a lot of the functionality that you'll want out of IIS will probably require Active Server Pages because that turns on quite a few snazzy little features for you. And after all, Internet web servers are really all about catching eyeballs, people's eyeballs out there on the internet. I don't mean kind of literally. I just mean people want to be able to see your web and say, ooh, hey, that's a cool script there that made that little thing flash up there and look really neat. So you might want some of those kinds of things because it also interoperates well with certain kinds of applications for you. And then we could also get remote administration. This allows you to use an internet web browser to remotely administer this server. Now, it says remote. You can also do it locally. The advantage of this little guy here is it's really a nice interface, very easy to work with, and it's a little bit less baffling than right-clicking on all the different stuff within the Internet Services Manager console. The remote desktop web connection will simply allow me to be able to manage this server remotely through a web browser. This is kind of a terminal services kind of an idea, which again we'll talk about also later on in this same series. And then there's the basic service itself, which we discussed. I'll just leave it with the default values for right now, and if we want to, we could add some of those other items back in. And then I'll just click OK, and then next through this. Now, while this is installing, because it does take a few moments, let me also point out that, yes, you have to provide the CD that supplies this disk, or you can supply the network location like I just did, supplies the source files. The other way you could do this is you could go to Administrative Tools, and you could use the Configure Your Server Wizard, or you could use this other option down here, which is the Manage Your Server page, and that's the page that appears by default when you log on to Windows Server 2003 for the first time, unless you have checked this checkbox down at the bottom. Microsoft kind of has a preference for us using this Manage Your Server page to add, remove roles and to manage our servers. In order to do this, you just click Add or Remove a Role, and basically it just starts the wizard for you to configure your server wizard, which is already running right now, so I can't really open it in 2 instances. In any case, they both give us the same thing, just the ability to install IIS. When this is done, I'll see you on the other side. Now once you've installed IIS, it will then appear on the Start menu, and you can click on Start, Administrative Tools, and then IIS Manager over here. Once we get into this, we see that it just starts up at the root node. In reality, the first time you access this, it will probably take you to the Web Service Extensions node down here. And this might be the first time you've seen something like this because previous versions of Windows did not have this. But basically, it gives you the ability to work with Web Service Extensions. Web Service Extensions are simply, you can also consider those to be web applets or web applications. We want to know what kinds of web applications can be run. And while a lot of this is a little beyond our scope, let's just quickly run down what some of these things mean. First of all, the unknown iispart extensions. And iispart is IIS APIs, or Application Programming Interface, and CGI is Common Gateway Interface extensions. And what you do with these is you can just, right now they're all unknown iispart extensions and CGI extensions are prohibited, which is a good security measure. You could choose allow, but I can't really think of a good reason why you would do that just in a broad-based way unless you're either in a test environment or you're in a totally isolated network that has no vulnerability from the public internet. Because otherwise that is quite a vulnerability. Now some of these can be allowed in stages. For example, if I allow active server pages, then by clicking allow over here, which is probably going to be something that I'm going to need to do eventually anyway, then that will also allow me to use one of the iispart extensions. And the iispart extension associated with active server pages is asp.dll, and in fact, if we click on the properties, we see that the required file indeed is asp.dll. And you can add additional ones if you need to by clicking on Add New Web Service Extensions, and it takes you through a real simple interface so that you can specify a friendly name and the file necessary to run the application. Now, Internet Data Connector would allow me to have a web page that connects to back-end data. For example, on a back-end database where I'd have maybe a database that tells me whether or not an item is in stock or whether a price has been updated or something like that, so that my users might be able to do more intelligent online shopping or something like this. Server-side includes would then be something that would send along with the user's GET request when they request data from my web. It would include additional information that the administrators have specified. It might be something like a paid advertisement from a vendor that we have, and so then when the user accesses our web page, it also includes a little pop-up type of an ad that appears. It's not quite a pop-up, but it might be something that floats on the top of the screen and that the users have to close to see past. Those annoying little things. Hopefully we don't include too many of those in our web. Anyway, we also have WebDAV, which is Web Distributed Application and Versioning. And this allows us to publish and manage resources on a web page. And it's going to be secured in a much more intelligent fashion than something like a general FTP upload. This depends, by the way, on HTTP version 1.1, and it secures the ability to transmit data up and down across the web. And depending on the configuration of the server, it's capable of using Secure Sockets Layer, or SSL, to protect the information. It can protect the password, and it also can protect the data depending upon your configuration. Now, I used to teach a 2-day course in IIS administration. And this course, we're going to address the basics of the administration. So, of course, we're not going to cover 2 days' worth of material because IIS is a big topic. However, we do want to address the main administration that you'll need to know about in order to intelligently manage IIS. So let's start, first of all, with the properties of the server itself. So wherever the name of your server is, just right-click on it within IIS Manager and choose its properties. And here we'll see a couple of key things that we can look at. Number one, you can enable direct metabase edit. This means that I can edit the metabase, which is the configuration of this web server and/or all of its websites, and I can do that while IIS is running, as opposed to having to pause a website, make my edit changes, and then play the website again or start the service again. So this prevents that kind of a thing from happening, and it's very convenient. In order to use this, you also have to have something called the history feature, which is enabled by default, and this keeps track of a history of your metabase so that you can always kind of have a running backup of your metabase in case something goes wrong. You see that you can also encode web logs in UTF-8. UTF is Unicode Transformation Format, and then 8 is just a version of the UTF format. This really just allows you to use multiple character sets from just about any written language. And if you're just in an English-speaking country and you mostly work with English, you may not need to be concerned with this at all. And then we have the MIME types, which is the multipurpose Internet Mail Extensions types. And this is kind of strange because it has little, if anything, to do with mail. But if you click on this, you see that it gives you the various file types. So that if, for example, I were to click on a file with a certain kind of an extension, then it could start a certain kind of an application, an audio-visual kind of an application, a player of some kind, any different types of things like this. Now, the idea here is it's similar to what would happen if you were to double-click on a file with an XLS file. It would normally start Microsoft Excel, provided you've got it installed. .doc, probably start WordPad or Microsoft Word. That's kind of the idea. We have MIME types here so that your web server knows how to handle files of certain types. Now also under Application Pool, this is a new kind of thing in Windows Server 2003, and that allows you to configure a pool that multiple applications, web applications, can run inside of. And then you can help to configure the stability of that pool so that, for example, if it uses a certain amount of CPU utilization or certain other kinds of resources, you can cause it to be throttled so it doesn't use too much CPU utilization. You can very granularly configure how you want your apps to run. And you might have some applications you want to be very protected, so you might create a separate application pool entirely that's dedicated for one application. So application pools is kind of into more of almost of a programming idea because you have to work closely with your web programmers to know what the requirements are for that. But it's very flexible, and it does give us quite a lot of configuration power as administrators when we want to fine-tune our web applications. And then here's where the big stuff is right here. It's our websites and the default website that we have to begin with. The default website's always there to start, and you'll see that installed by default. And then we have various website properties as well. Now, I'm going to right-click on websites and choose properties, and I'm going to really just skip most of everything we see here except for one tab. The reason for that is because we're going to see all this again in just a minute, and I'm going to explain all these items there. However, on the Service tab, we have something that is only specific to the websites item, and this is the only time I'll see this. Now, iOS 6, which is the version that Windows Server 2003 runs, uses something called Worker Process Isolation Mode. And what this does is it helps applications to be more stable and to run more reliably. But if you have certain applications that cannot work with that or that were designed only for iOS 5 and that cannot seem to run properly within Windows Server 2003's iOS 6, Worker Process Isolation Mode, then of course you'll check this box. Now, this is something to really be careful about here, because if you check this box saying, hey, I got this one little applet that just won't quite run on iOS 6 Worker Process Isolation Mode, what you've done by selecting this box is you've taken all of your websites, even if you've got 1,000 of them here, and you're forcing them all to run in iOS 5 isolation mode. So that's a big step. If you really have to have that, you might consider dedicating a server, a single iOS server, to running this iOS 5 isolation mode. And then you can use HTTP compression, which is mostly a good idea almost under any circumstance, because compression now, it's always requires some CPU utilization, but with the speed of processors and the capability of servers these days, compression does not give us the performance hit that it used to. So I would compress your application files, and this will help to relieve some network bandwidth by sending smaller chunks of data across to the clients when they request the application files. And then if you do this, you also have to choose to compress the static files here. And that would just be your static web content. And then, of course, you see here that there is a directory that you can use by default. It's in the Windows directory, and you see the rest there. Now also, wherever you put those temporary files must be an NTFS partition. You should not compress that drive. You should not share that drive. And it has to be a local drive. It can't be a network drive. Now, the maximum temporary directory size, which it uses for increasing performance, would be unlimited by default, but you can also limit it to a certain size. And for example, here it's got 95 megabytes by default. It might not be a bad idea. Just determine how big the web is that you're using and how much space you're going to be needing for your websites here. And then you might set up a reasonable size here in accordance with that. And that will help to then give you a fixed size right off the bat. Will reduce fragmentation for you as well. Now, all of those properties that we just looked at for the website's properties, anything I configure there will flow down to all of my websites regardless. However, if I right-click on a specific website and choose its properties, anything I configure here that conflicts with or differs from my default website's properties will overrule. So my specific website's properties here will take precedence. Now to begin with here, I just enter in a description, and by default we have the default website. You can enter in another name, and that's just for your own purposes. The users will never see that. For example, I might just enter in Nugget Lab Web or something like this. And then this is an important item right here, the IP address. It says all unassigned. First of all, keep in mind that there's only one website, even if you have 1,000 of them listed down here, there's only one website that can have all unassigned. And the usefulness of this with the default website, especially if you're somebody like an ISP, is that if you have another website down here from one of your customers and it's down for some reason, then any of the requests to their website can go back to, by default, this default website, regardless of what you've named it here. This is still my default website with all unassigned IP addresses, and then it can retrieve any of those requests for the client, and you might just make this a standard web page of some kind that says, hello, welcome to our ISP. The website you're looking for is currently down, please call technical support or whatever you want it to say. Now otherwise, you can click the little down arrow here and from the drop-down list specify one of the IP addresses that you have. And this is useful on a multi-homed network card. So for example, you can assign multiple IP addresses through your IP properties on your network card. You can assign it multiple IP addresses, and that way I might have website A comes to this IP address, website B comes to this one, and so on and so forth. That's one way of multi-homing. Now, if that one network card gets burdened with too many access requests through too many different IP addresses, and it's exceeding it's really what it can handle, you can install another network card and assign additional IP addresses to it and distribute the load. And that would be another way of multi-homing. And that specific way of multi-homing with two network cards is called duplexing. You also identify which TCP port you want to use. By default, HTTP pages use port 80. You can specify another port if you want to, but after the end of whatever the address is that the user types in, they have to follow it with a colon, and then whatever number you specify here, preferably something 1023 or above 1023 in the port number, because there's several in the first 1023 that are what we call well-known port numbers, and you don't want to accidentally duplicate a port number that's designated for another service. There's also a SSL port. If you use SSL, then if you configure everything you need for that, it'll automatically fill in 443 here, or you can identify a different SSL port again if you want above 1023, and again your clients would have to enter in a colon followed by whatever number you specify here to access your web. Now, with all this identification, there can be some things that are necessarily mutually exclusive. So, for example, maybe I've got 10.10.10.20 assigned to Nugget Lab Web, and it always uses port 80. However, if I've got another website that I'm going to build down here, it's going to come through the same IP address, okay, fine, and it comes through the same port number, okay, fine. It will allow me to create it, but when I do that, it'll give me a big red X on the site, and it'll be stopped. And it will not be able to start it because IIS is going to be confused. It says, hey, I got incoming requests, but I got a single IP address and port number designated here, so where am I supposed to send it to? And it'll just default it to whatever website had it first. The way around that is to go to the Advanced button over here, and there's actually couple of ways around this, but this is one of the ways. You can go to Advanced and add an additional identity for this site, because you see, when the user sends in a request for the HTTP site, they send in the host header value, the name of the site that they're looking for, beyond just the IP address and port number that they're using. So they might put in something like this, IP address 10.10.10.20 with the same port number here, and host header value of www.cbtnuggets.com, and hit OK. And that way, as long as they're trying to access www.cbtnuggets.com, the IIS server sees that in the host header value and can direct them to the appropriate site. You can do the same thing for SSL sites. Of course, this server is not configured for SSL because we don't have a certificate authority installed right now. But if we did, then we'd have the add, remove, edit buttons available. And you identify these not by different host header values, but by varying SSL port numbers. And we'll address host header values a little bit more later on when we work with another website. But let's go ahead and take a look at the connections down here. This enable HTTP keep alives relates to how many times the web server allows a connection to be established and torn down. You see, if a client is downloading a web page that has 30 elements on it, including graphics, maybe a JavaScript, all this kind of thing, then if this is deselected, then they have to establish a connection, download one element, close the connection. Establish another connection, download the element, close the connection. And this means that that server is going to get hammered with establishing and tearing down connections when it ought to be able to just keep one connection open, download all contents, and then only time out or close that connection after 120 seconds. And that's exactly what this setting does the way I've got it configured now. If you find that you're having too many connections that are left open and it's starting to affect server performance, and you can get clients to download within less than 120 seconds all of the elements that they commonly need, you can shorten that to another practical number according to your needs. Then you can also enable logging. I can't think of a good reason to disable logging. Pretty much you want to do this, especially in today's security environment where we need to be able to know what's going on or to be able to at least look to a log to find out when something could have gone wrong. And we have several different kinds of log format that we can do with this. Now, of these log file formats, we start with the ODBC, or Open Database Connectivity Logging, and that's the default format that allows you to interoperate with databases and would make it then easier to search, filter, and otherwise manipulate your web data. We can also take a look at IS log file format, NCSA common log file format, and W3C extended log file format. And these are all various forms of an ASCII format. With the ODBC logging, I would have to select this option, and then I'd have to choose the properties, which would allow me to enter in the credentials and necessary requirements to connect to the database that I'm working with. And then we could also work with, again, these other log file formats. IIS would be a very simplistic log file format, which would include some rudimentary information. And you see the properties here, you allow you to specify how often it creates a new log, or you can also specify an unlimited or a limited file size according to whatever number you type here in megabytes, as well as the location of the log file directory. Now, if you expect a very busy log file, especially if you're going to go into one of the more verbose file formats, you might consider putting this on a different spindle, different hard drive, physically separate from your very busy website hard drive. You can also go to, again, to the NCSA common log file format. Again, the properties are the same for that, as well as this W3C extended log file format. And the advantage with this one is, if you need to be very specific about what kind of information you derive from the log, you can see that on the Advanced tab here, you can specify exactly what items you want to select or deselect. So this will allow you to either remove items that are too verbose and that you don't need, and add items for which you really need to see information. Now, I've canceled out of those properties, and before we get too involved, let's just go back and take a step back and look at the website itself. And because I'm going to do this, I'm going to actually also add another website as well in a little while here. And that will help us to further understand more about the host header values that we discussed a moment ago. Now, you can just kind of get a preview of what your website's going to look like by right-clicking on the web and then choosing Browse, and that opens it up in a pane over here on the right-hand side. You can see the default website is just an under-construction web page, for example. Now, in my case, I want to go ahead and create another website, so I'll just right-click on Websites and choose New Website. I can also choose Website from File if I already had all of the content and configuration information necessary. And here, I would simply browse for an XML file that had the configuration that I needed, because remember, the metabase and the configuration for our websites is stored in an XML format, which stands for Extensible Markup Language. And it also seems to be the direction that Microsoft's going for much of their configuration items. In our case, however, we can create one from scratch, so we'll just right-click New and then Website. And this will also give us some practical experience in actually just creating web content. So we'll just call this cbtnuggets.com site, for example. Just enter, again, a description that makes sense to you. And I can leave it all unassigned, or I can specify the IP address again if I like, with the port number of 80 and a host header value. Now, here's the key. When I create another website on the same server, it has to have one of these three values be unique. I cannot have all of the three exact same values for two different websites. Right now, my default website is at .20, port 80, with no value here for the host header value. So if I next finish through this wizard, it's going to get a red X on its little globe for that website, and this website that I'm about to create will be stopped. However, if I add some uniqueness to it, such as giving it a host header value, www.cbtnuggets.com, for example, now it's unique, so I can go ahead and click on Next and continue on creating this website, where I've gone ahead and pre-created some content under my documents here, under my webs, and then my web. And I just did all this so you wouldn't have to watch me type and create web content all day, because after all, this is not a web publishing or a web content creation course. So go ahead and click on Next here, and then we see the various descriptions, or rather the various permissions that are available. Read, of course, meaning that you can just read it. Read scripts such as active server pages. This is normally a safe thing to make, because active server pages are normally okay to run just as generic scripts. Our iispart and CGI execute permissions we might need to be careful with for permissions purposes. And then we can also specify whether they can write to this directory. Normally that's not going to be the case for static web content, unless it's something like a form that a user needs to fill out or something like that. You can also select Browse, but that would mean that they could do directory browsing, which might not be a good security idea, because they could be able to determine more information about the way you've got your web set up and might be able to see something that is not permissible really there. So we'll just go ahead and click on Next here, and then that's pretty much it. We'll finish the wizard, and then we see we now have a cbtnuggets.com website. Okay, well now we've got a couple of websites that we can look at, so let's go ahead and take a look first of all at our default website, which is on dcnugget1.nuggetlab.com. A couple of different ways of doing this, and you may be familiar with these, so I'll quickly address these so we don't spend a lot of time on it. But we simply start off with HTTP:// and then of course we go to, in this case, you could use an IP address like 127.0.0.1 and press enter, and that takes it to our under construction web page. Of course, that's only because it's only working because I'm on the local server. I could also go to 10.10.10.20, which is the actual IP address, and this would work if I was on another computer, a remote computer, for example. And that takes me, of course, to the same location. And then finally, I could go to HTTP:// and then dcnugget1.nuggetlab.com. And that's the literal server in a literal fully qualified domain name. So finally, of course, that takes me there as well. But you're thinking to yourself, James, my users don't know the name of my IIS web server. How do you expect them to know where to go? So I'm going to go over here, and I'm just going to do what the user would do. The user will say, I know they told me to do HTTP:// I don't know what that means, but I do know that www means World Wide Web and then the name of the company.com. Okay, I'll just do that. Okay. Oh, page cannot be displayed. Huh. Well, they told me they finished setting up the web server and we're supposed to have an internet presence. How come I can't get there? Well, that's because we haven't addressed DNS yet. And DNS is a little beyond our scope. However, DNS is a domain name system, and it allows us to enter in a name like www, because what this is really saying to the browser is, I'm looking for a server by the name of www in the nuggetlab.com domain. Well, DNS would then resolve or translate that into an IP address, and since we don't have that yet for nuggetlab.com, we're going to have to come up with something here. So, what we'll have to come up with is a www alias. So we right-click here and choose New Alias or CNAME. CNAME also means canonical name, and that's kind of the Unix equivalent of an alias. So that's why it has both names there. Anyway, the alias I want is www. That means when a user types in www.nuggetlab.com, I go to dcnugget1.nuggetlab.com. Okay? And then that's pretty much all I need. Now I have that CNAME record. So now when I go back over here and try to access this again, I'll just go up here and press enter again. Ooh, it still tells me the page cannot be displayed. Well, how can that be? I know it's right now. My administrator says they entered in the CNAME record, whatever that is. So what's the problem? Well, you see, in this case, it's because the client on the client side has not yet cleared the cache. You see, since this client remembers that it was not able to successfully resolve www.nuggetlab.com in the past, it does what's called negative caching, and it memorizes the fact that it can't do that. That means that it will preserve and save time the next time it tries to access that same site and says, hey, we couldn't find it last time, why bother the DNS server this time? Well, you can figure all that out by, or clear all that out by doing ipconfig flush DNS. And that kind of gives your DNS cache amnesia, and then you press enter, and now when I try to access nuggetlab.com, it takes me to my under construction web page or whatever other content you've specified. And the reason why it worked this time was because since I'd cleared it out of the cache, it says, hey, I don't know anything about www.nuggetlab.com, therefore I'm going to have to find a DNS server. And then when it queries my DNS server, it gets an answer this time because it actually has a www CNAME record. Now, likewise, if I want to access www.cbtnuggets.com, I have to create another alias for that one. And so we'll enter in dcnugget1.nuggetlab.com when anyone types in www.cbtnuggets.com, and we'll OK this. Now we can go back into our browser, www.cbtnuggets.com, and press enter. Now, here I get a prompt for entering credentials. Why am I getting this? Normally I wouldn't, but remember where my content was? It was stored on an NTFS file location underneath the administrators, or excuse me, under the trainers, my documents location. So, trying to access that document, it's not a document that has everyone full control or anything like that, or other broad open access, so I need to enter in the credentials of the person that's actually using that, that directory. Press enter, and now it takes us to the web. Welcome to our web. You're redirected via a host header value, and there's a picture of a big gorilla there. Why? Because I was playing around with clip art, and I really liked the gorilla. Okay, no good reason. And before you get too critical of my little gorilla there, just remember, I did say earlier that this is not a web design class. Of course, probably right about now you're wishing that this was a web design class. And now let's also just review why we're actually able to get here. Why? Because number one, we have a DNS entry for the www CNAME here, which is right here. It's our alias CNAME that points us to DC Nugget 1. Once our query gets to DC Nugget 1, however, how does DC Nugget 1 know which website to serve up to us? Because in the properties of cbtnuggets.com, in our advanced item here, remember we do have a host header value so that when it receives a host header value of cbtnuggets.com, it'll point us right there to that website. In this nugget, we introduced IIS, or Internet Information Server, and this was part one. We looked at the installation of IIS because it's not installed by default like it was in previous versions of Windows, and it's really easy to do. And then once we've installed it, you need to configure the server with various options as well, and we looked at those. Then there's a property sheet not only for all of the websites, but also for each individual website. In this nugget, we took a look at the first part of that, and in the next nugget, which is IIS Part 2, we'll conclude our look at the property sheet. Probably 90% of your administration is going to be managing those property sheets somehow or another. There's quite a lot involved there. Then we took a look at several different ways to view the website after you've created it, which we can also do here. And it has a real simple-to-use wizard that takes you through a next, finish kind of wizard. When you view the website, a key part of that is making sure that the domain naming system, or DNS, is configured properly, and particularly with the proper www host records for your alias or CNAME records. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.